Good afternoon and welcome to the League of Women Voters Forum on Protecting Our Vote. My name is Christy Bardenhagen and I'm the Vice President of the League of Women Voters, Leelanau County. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. It also works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and also influences public policy through education and advocacy. We never ever support or oppose candidates or parties. Men and women who are 16 years of age and American citizens may join the League. The Leelanau League currently has nearly 170 members and 35% of those are men. More information on the League may be found at our website, lwvleelanau.org. Dues are $60 a year or $90 for a family. Membership applications can be found online at our website and also on the table out in the hallway. Today we host a forum called Protect Our Vote, featuring League of Women Voters of Michigan President Judy Karanjeff and Advocacy Vice President Joan Huno. They will focus on how citizens obtain the right to vote, the importance of this right, the history of voter suppression then and now, and ways voting can be protected and made more accessible. Also, please stay until the end when we will have a drawing which will honor 4 members of the audience with a gift. We have a box set of the 3-volume graphic novel March by Congressman John Lewis, The King Years by Taylor Branch, The Fight to Vote by Michael Waldman, or Give Us the Ballot by Ari Behrman. And you need to sign a slip of paper and put your name in the basket. The LWV Michigan Protect the Vote project is one of 16 state projects nationwide and is supported by the National League of Women Voters Education Fund. Our next public forum will be Wednesday, January 3rd. We will feature Craig Mauger of the Michigan Campaign Finance Network, who will speak about the corrosive effect of dark money on our political system. We're also sending around an RSVP sheet for our annual holiday luncheon, which takes place on December 6th. It's for members. Please sign on there if you wish to attend. Also, in case you don't know, bathrooms, you go through the door over there and on your left. And there's a drinking fountain there as well. Now I would like Joan and Judy to take over.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Christy.
You'll have to turn the blue mic off.
Okay. Got it.
Thank you very much for coming today. In addition to all those announcements that Christy noted, we also have on the table here to the side of the room postcards that we ask you to sign before you leave today. The postcards are to be addressed to our state senator and our state representative, and Judy will tell you more during her part of the presentation about their purpose. This is entitled Stand Up, Protect the Vote, so I'm going to ask all of you to stand if you're a registered voter. And everyone is. And please continue standing if you have registered voters. If you've registered a voter, continue standing. Everybody else, take a seat. Continue standing, those of you who have registered voters, if you have registered more than 50 voters. How about 25? Okay, someone's registered 25 voters, so that's BJ. Let's give her a hand. How many of you have had difficulty at the polls? Oh, and here's somebody else who registered 25 voters, I think. You're still standing. Sorry, I didn't see you. Ah,
It was long ago.
you did it? That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah. How many of you had difficulty at the polls? Yes, we've got a few hands too. Can you just briefly describe what that difficulty was?
Sure.
Yeah.
I had recently moved down in Livingston County, and supposedly I had sent my change in registration too soon to the actual vote, even though I had sent it back in April, and the vote had been in November, obviously. So I had to drive to my previous location to vote that day.
And you did that? To
Yeah,
Livingston,
of
you
course
drove
I
to
did.
Livingston County?
Yeah.
Yeah.
About a half hour.
Anyone else? Yes.
My sister-in-law just recently moved here and from California, and she's out at Orchard Creek Skilled Nursing Unit and is not able to travel easily. So I went in to register in Green Lake Township, and they said, oh, well, she has to come in. And I said, she's not coming in. You know, she's in a bed and we're not being able to do that. And they said, well, we don't know what we can do. And then I looked at them and I said, she has a right to vote. And all of a sudden, they said, okay, we'll come out to Orchard Creek and we will register. And they actually came out twice to make sure she was registered. So it just took being a little assertive and saying, hey guys, this is something you have to do. But they were ready to kind of push me out the door and help pat me on the head.
I'm glad you had a good experience.
It is, you know,
It is
they were
difficult.
wonderful once they decided.
Yes, yeah. It is difficult for us as we get older. There have been barriers to the vote in the United States of America since our founding. As you're well aware, I am sure from your history lessons, when we started, only propertied white men could vote in this country. That's slowly changed over the last couple hundred years. Michael Waldman, who is the author of one of these books and the director of the Brennan Center for Justice, which is attached to the New York University NYU Law School, has recently said, written this book about this very thing, and said that from the beginning, our effort to vote has been a struggle, and sometimes it has been a deadly struggle. We have had a wave of restrictive voting laws passed in the last decade, 2 decades really, in this country. So again, we are in a situation where we are having to fight to vote. That right is not automatic any longer. He has said, as we've gradually extended the right, that I think what he has said, he has prompted us to ask ourselves, why do they not want us at the polls? And when you think about what the United States is, it is an experiment in government. It is an effort at collective self-government. And that is not a universally accepted principle. It's quite radical, and we do our best to ensure that we have collective self-government that promises equality for all in this country. When President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965, he said that the vote is the most powerful instrument we've ever devised to break down injustice and to break down the terrible walls that imprison men because they're different from other men. Oop. So over the last several hundred years, we've slowly added amendments to the Constitution. The first 3 really to ensure the right to vote after the Civil War are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. We've had the
13th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born, and that was added in 65. And then the 14th, which was added in 1868, which extended the equal protection of the law to all people in this country. That particular amendment to the U.S. Constitution has been the most litigated amendment in our history. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And of course, in 1920, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. That was a very hard-fought battle, as those of us in the League of Women Voters are well aware. Among the efforts that were undertaken for women to gain the ballot box was an effort that lasted for 2 years, 1913 to 1915, that included 5,000 women. It was really the first effort of highly visible, nonviolent civil disobedience in this country. The women were known as the Silent Sentinels. They stood quietly at the gates to the White House, to the grounds of the White House, with signs asking for the right to vote. And over the course of that 2 years, hundreds and hundreds of women were arrested. They were imprisoned, oftentimes for up to 6 or 7 months. And Alice Paul, who is a founder of the League, went on a hunger strike at that time and was force-fed while she was in prison. The Silent Sentinels really were the precursors to the nonviolent voting efforts that we saw, the voting registration efforts we saw during the 1960s in this country. In 1924, Native Americans, not by constitutional amendment, but by an act of Congress, received the right to vote in this country, although Native Americans were often denied access to the polls until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In fact, the Native American Voting Rights Fund has taken 74 different cases up through the federal courts since 1965, since the Voting Rights Act. So this is still a right that people struggle to achieve. And then finally, in terms of amendments, we had the 26th Amendment in 1971, which gave people who are 18 or over the right to vote. Almost from the start of our founding, there's been a backlash. That right to vote is seen as extremely powerful, and every time another group of individuals or of our citizens has sought it, there's been people who stood opposed to their effort. We have state laws that were passed from roughly 1890 forward, and all of them were designed originally to suppress the vote. Even to the two at the top of the list there, which we think of today as pretty good ideas. Voter registration itself, there was only one state, the state of Massachusetts, where there were registered voters before the Civil War, and after the Civil War, we had virtually every state registering voters. The secret ballot was originally known as the Australian ballot. Australia adopted a secret ballot in the 1850s. The United Kingdom followed in the 1870s. In 1888, the first state, or the first city really in this country, Louisville, Kentucky, adopted a secret ballot. And by about the 1890s, we had most of the states using a secret ballot. We also had literacy tests, poll taxes, religious tests. In many states, felons, once convicted felons, even if they've served their time in prison, can no longer vote. It's not true in Michigan. You can if you've paid your debt to society. This is a literacy test. We have a couple literacy tests from a couple states here in the next slide. But as you can see, the literacy tests were very prevalent in the counties in the South, and in most instances, it was an effort to thwart the African American vote. We did have literacy tests all through the North and in the West as well, however. up until the 1920s, there were 13 different states that in which you had to be literate, be able to read and write in order to vote. We in the North and the West did not, of course, have literacy tests that looked like this one, which was still being administered in Selma, Alabama in 1965, the year of the Voting Rights Act. So you can see that even if you could read, this was designed to stop you from registering if you didn't have deep and pretty esoteric information about procedures in our democracy. I don't know if everyone could pass that in this room. Or this is even a more pernicious one. This is an effort in Louisiana it's so nonsensical that it's very difficult for anyone to follow it in a way that would get them by the door. And of course, these were not administered uniformly. They'd be administered depending on who you were when you walked through the door. Before we had these kinds of tests, we had instances with, for example, voter registration in the state of New York. Early on, voter registration was just designed for people in cities, people who were recent immigrants. In the state of New York, if you lived in a rural area where everybody knew you, the assumption was that they'd know you were a citizen and you didn't need to register. But in the city of New York City, you had to register. They also made efforts to limit the number of people who would register in that city by having only 2 days during the year where you could register, and one of those was Yom Kippur. So they were successful in forcing Jewish people off the rolls, or denying them the opportunity to be on it at all. So our fight to vote really takes its modern understanding of it in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. This is the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and you'll remember that literacy test was still in effect in Selma, Alabama in 1965. By 1965, in Selma, there had been a 2-year voting registration drive underway in that city. The Southern Leadership, the Student Leadership Nonviolent Coordinating Council, the one that Congressman John Lewis headed, had undertaken a 2-year effort there. They'd succeeded in registering fewer than 100 voters. And the reason for that is that a local judge down there had issued an injunction in that area that prohibited more than 3 people from gathering together for the purpose of voter registration. And it was wildly successful, although the people in the community, the African Americans in the community, walked every day for 2 years. Think back now to our silent sentinels at the White House. Every day for 2 years, they'd go stand in line at the county courthouse and be arrested. And they were arrested and sent to the Selma prison farm. So there were many, many scores of people who were arrested during that 2-year period. Finally, one of the churches in the area in Selma in January of 1965 said, enough. We're going to have a mass meeting, what they called mass meetings, and we're going to challenge this injunction. So from then on, from January on to March of that year, people marched from the church to the city hall in order to register to vote. And they too, of course, were arrested, and they were arrested en masse. And at the time, there was a sheriff in that area called Clark, and he had deputized a lot of people in the community who didn't really have much law enforcement training. They would arrest people en masse as they marched in to register, and then force them to run from the spot they were standing down to the jail, which was several blocks away. And so you have very brutal photos that remain in our archives of older people, talking about older people in nursing homes, but older people who went to try to register, who were forced to run down the street in order to place themselves in the jail cell. That's what was happening in Selma in 1965, and that takes us to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is a small bridge, 250 feet long. It spans the Alabama River. The Alabama River is what separates Selma from Dallas County on the other side. It's named after a man who is built as in the 40s, but it was named after a Confederate Brigadier General, Edmund Pettus. He also served as the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama, and he was a U.S. Senator from Alabama. This bridge spanned the river, and across it you went if you wanted to travel from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And it was here that the people who were registering voters in Selma decided to make a stand. And they did that following the death of a young man who was protesting in a town called Marion, 30 miles away from Selma. So on March, would it have been the 7th of March in 1965, people gathered on this bridge, decided they were going to walk to Montgomery, the state capital, and protest the fact that for 2 years they'd had this horrible effort. There were 3 marches over this bridge, and we've got a little bit of video from that march. 3 marches, one on the 7th, one on the 9th, and one on the 21st of March in 1965. Okay. And we have someone in the room who was on the march. It's Judy Kranjak. She was in the 3rd march as a young student from Judy, our president, our league president. The first march was led by John Lewis. It's called Bloody Sunday. The second march on Tuesday was led by
Excuse me, ma'am. Could you move the microphone away from your thing? It's causing interference.
I think you need to turn it off.
The second march was
Thank
on
you.
Tuesday. It was called the Ministers' March. After Bloody Sunday, there was a call put out to ministers across the nation, and many responded. A man was killed, a Unitarian minister was killed that Tuesday, in that Tuesday march. The good news was on that Tuesday of March 9th in 1965, Governor George Romney, then Governor George Romney, and then the mayor of Detroit led 10,000 people down Woodard Avenue in Detroit in honor, this was happening across the country, in recognition of what was happening down in Selma. And then on the 21st, and Martin Luther King tried to lead a group of about 2,000 people over the bridge that day. He didn't have the protection of the U.S. government at that point, so he stopped when he got to the other side of the bridge, 250 feet. He had everyone kneel in prayer, had everyone turn around and go back to the church. Then on the 21st of the month, we had the protection, people had the protection of the government, and were able to start that walk to Montgomery, where there is today, if you've been there is a memorial honoring the 115 people who were killed trying to get the right to vote in the South. But let's go to that. Judy's helping me here. So what it looked like that day. You know, I knew Judy 20 years before I knew she was in the march in Selma. She doesn't like to talk about it.
At times, history and faith meet at a single time, in a single place. This march will not dictate to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
We were kids who had grown up in cotton fields and had just gone out and started demonstrating. We were their teachers, so we thought that we should be out there too.
If it is necessary, we are willing and must be willing to go to jail by the thousands in Alabama.
If this was going to take place, the youth in Selma had to do it. There was never a time when we were without fear. We may get seriously hurt. We may get killed.
Truman advanced.
didn't have a clue you were making history. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marking up the freedom.
So I'm going to make a transition, and while I'm making this transition, I'll tell you a little bit about what I remember from a lot of years ago, as you can imagine. But I was a student at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and believe me, my parents did not send me here for this experience. But 5 of us were asked by the university to represent Southern Methodist in the 3rd March. And there were about 3,000 in that march total from all over the country. And the 5 of us, I mean, look back on this and think about my kids and grandkids and understand my parents better. But we got in a car and we drove over through the night. And 2 of us were undergraduate students. We had a professor and 2 theology students from Perkins Seminary. And we drove through the night, and one of the professors was African American. So when we stopped for gas or food, we had to put them on the floor and hide them, going across in Mississippi to Alabama. And let alone my experiences that day are still hard to remember, because I've never seen that kind of hatred. The people on the side of the march, including the National Guard that had been deputized, the National Guard had Confederate flags over their name tag, and they were protecting us. And there were helicopters in the sky. And then there were people on the side with kids and dogs and guns that were just shouting stuff at us as we marched that day. And so those are some of my recollections. And leaving there, we went back to school. And because we had been part of that day, we came back over for the march into Montgomery, which was like 5 days later. As I remember, it was Sunday. And we marched downtown, and if you've seen the movie Selma, it's a little different in that, because they actually had Martin Luther King on the Capitol grounds, and actually he wasn't allowed on the Capitol grounds. He had to be on the back of a truck. There's a lot of, still, as you can tell, very fresh memories from that time. But the good news was it resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things, after reading all these books and participating during some of this time, in voting rights and still being active, obviously, with the League of Women